What happens when a country stops fighting its enemies and starts fighting itself? That is the question at the heart of civil war. Most people think this movie is about war. It isn't. At least not entirely. Because the most dangerous wars are not always fought with weapons. Sometimes they are fought with ideas, with fear, with anger, with division. And once those things grow strong enough, they can tear apart even the strongest nations. The world inside civil war feels chaotic from the very beginning. Cities are unstable, trust is disappearing, people are choosing sides. Nobody seems certain what comes next. And honestly, that uncertainty is what makes the story so powerful. Because uncertainty changes people. When life feels stable, people are calm, they plan, they cooperate, they think long-term. But when everything feels uncertain, fear begins making decisions. And fear is rarely a good leader. Fear makes people reactive. Fear makes people suspicious. Fear makes people forget what matters most. That is why the journalists at the center of the story become so important. While everyone else is choosing sides, they are chasing something different. The truth. Not comfort. Not approval. The truth. And searching for truth is dangerous. Because truth often forces people to confront realities they would rather avoid. Most people think courage means running toward danger. But courage has many forms. Sometimes courage means asking difficult questions. Sometimes courage means refusing to repeat popular opinions. Sometimes courage means documenting reality even when reality is uncomfortable. That kind of courage is rare. Because truth has a cost. The characters travel through a country that feels increasingly fractured. Every road carries uncertainty. Every conversation carries tension. Every decision could be dangerous. Yet they continue. Not because they are fearless, but because they understand something important. Information matters. Perspective matters. Truth matters. Without truth, fear fills the gap. And fear can destroy societies faster than bullets. That lesson applies far beyond war. People fight battles every day because of assumptions, misunderstandings, rumors, emotional reactions. Entire relationships collapse because nobody pauses long enough to seek understanding. Entire communities divide because people stop listening. The movie magnifies that reality on a national scale. But the principle remains the same. Division grows where understanding disappears. And understanding disappears when people stop listening. That is why the journey becomes about more than survival. It becomes about perspective. Because perspective changes everything. The moment you see the world only through one lens, you become trapped inside your own assumptions. But when you seek understanding, your world expands. Your reactions slow down. Your judgment improves. Your awareness deepens. And awareness is powerful. Because awareness allows people to respond instead of react. To think instead of panic. To understand instead of assume. That difference can change the direction of an entire life. Or an entire country. And that is where the movie becomes deeply human. Beneath the explosions, conflict, and tension is a reminder that every crisis tests character. Not just strength. Character. Who do you become when pressure rises? Who do you become when fear spreads? Who do you become when certainty disappears? Those questions matter. Because difficult times reveal what easy times conceal. When everything is comfortable, people can hide behind routine. They can avoid difficult questions. They can postpone important decisions. They can convince themselves that strength, courage, and character exist simply because life has never demanded proof. But pressure demands proof. Pressure exposes priorities. Pressure reveals values. Pressure shows what people truly believe when comfort disappears. That is why the world of civil war feels so unsettling. It is not just showing a country in crisis. It is showing people stripped of certainty, stripped of routine, stripped of the assumptions they once relied upon. And once those things disappear, something deeper emerges. Character. Some people become more compassionate during difficult times. Others become more fearful. Some become courageous. Others become consumed by survival. The crisis itself does not create these qualities. It reveals them. That is one of the most important lessons in the entire story. Life does not always build character. Sometimes it exposes the character that was already there. The journalists traveling through this fractured world understand this better than anyone. Every mile of their journey forces them to confront human nature directly. They witness courage and cruelty, hope and despair, unity and division. And through it all, they keep moving forward. Not because they believe the world is perfect, but because they believe understanding matters. That belief is powerful. Because understanding requires curiosity. And curiosity is the opposite of fear. Fear closes the mind. Curiosity opens it. Fear says, I already know. Curiosity says, let me learn. Fear creates walls. Curiosity creates bridges. And in a divided world, bridges become more valuable than ever. That is why the story feels bigger than politics, bigger than conflict, and bigger than war itself. At its core, it is about perspective. The ability to see beyond your immediate emotions. The ability to remain thoughtful while others become reactive. The ability to search for truth instead of comfort. And honestly, that ability is becoming rare. Most people want information that confirms what they already believe. They want certainty. They want simple answers to complicated problems. But reality is rarely simple. Reality demands patience. It demands observation. It demands humility. The journalists understand that. They know that the moment you stop questioning, you stop learning. The moment you stop learning, you become trapped inside your own assumptions. And assumptions can be dangerous. Because assumptions often feel like facts. People defend them, argue over them, build identities around them, without ever stopping to ask whether they are true. That is why awareness becomes such a powerful theme throughout the movie. Awareness allows people to step back from emotional reactions and see the larger picture. It allows them to recognize patterns others miss. It allows them to understand complexity instead of chasing easy answers. And understanding creates wisdom. Wisdom does not mean knowing everything. It means recognizing how much you still do not know. That humility protects people from arrogance. And arrogance is often where division begins. The moment people become completely convinced they cannot be wrong, conversation ends, learning ends, growth ends. But the characters who survive emotionally through the chaos remain open to observation, open to reality, open to seeing the world as it is instead of how they wish it would be. That openness becomes strength. Not physical strength. Mental strength. The strength to remain grounded while everything around you feels unstable. The strength to think clearly while others panic. The strength to stay human while the world becomes increasingly divided. And that may be the deepest lesson hidden inside Civil War. The greatest challenge during difficult times is not simply survival. It is preserving your humanity. Because chaos has a way of pushing people toward extremes, toward anger, toward fear, toward dehumanizing those they disagree with. But humanity requires something different. It requires empathy, patience, understanding, the willingness to remember that every person carries fears, hopes, and struggles that may not be immediately visible. That perspective changes everything. Because once you see people as human first, division loses some of its power. Hatred becomes harder. Understanding becomes easier. And even in the middle of conflict, hope remains possible. That is why the journey matters. Not because it promises easy solutions. Not because it guarantees peace. But because it reminds us that even when the world feels fractured, every person still has a choice. To react. Or to understand. To divide. Or to listen. To spread fear. or to seek truth. And those choices, repeated day after day, ultimately determine what kind of future gets built from the chaos, because chaos never has the final word. People do. That is the responsibility hidden inside every difficult period of history. Wars end, crises pass, systems change, but the choices people make during those moments determine what remains afterward. Fear can build destruction, but courage can build recovery. Anger can build division, but understanding can build unity. The future is rarely decided by one dramatic moment. More often, it is shaped by thousands of small decisions made by ordinary people under extraordinary pressure. That is what makes Civil War feel so relevant. The movie is not really asking whether a country can survive conflict. It is asking whether people can preserve their values while moving through it. That is a much harder challenge. Because when pressure becomes intense, principles become difficult to maintain. Patience becomes difficult. Empathy becomes difficult. Listening becomes difficult. And yet, those are the qualities that matter most. Anyone can be kind when life is easy. Anyone can be patient when nothing is at risk. Anyone can speak about values when those values cost nothing. But difficult times test commitment. They test whether principles are real or merely convenient. The journalists continue forward because they understand that witnessing matters, recording reality matters, preserving truth matters. They know future generations will only understand the present if someone has the courage to document it honestly. That idea extends beyond journalism. Everyone leaves a record behind. Not necessarily through photographs or articles, but through actions, through behavior, through the way they treat people when circumstances become difficult. That is your real legacy. Not what you said during comfortable times. What you did during uncomfortable ones. The movie constantly reminds us that every person becomes part of the story they are living through. Nobody remains completely separate from events around them. Everyone contributes something. Fear, hope, division, understanding. The question is what you choose to contribute. Because contribution compounds. One act of panic influences others. One act of courage influences others too. One thoughtful decision creates ripples. One reckless decision creates ripples as well. That is why awareness matters so much. People often underestimate the influence of their own behavior. They assume only leaders shape outcomes. Only powerful people matter. Only major events change history. But history is built by ordinary decisions repeated over time. A conversation. A choice. A response. A moment of restraint instead of reaction. Those moments seem small, until millions of them begin shaping the direction of a society. That is why the story ultimately becomes about responsibility. Responsibility for thoughts. Responsibility for actions. Responsibility for remaining human when circumstances encourage the opposite. Because losing humanity is easy. Maintaining it requires effort. It requires choosing understanding when misunderstanding feels easier. It requires choosing truth when comfortable illusions feel safer. It requires choosing character when nobody is watching. Those choices rarely receive applause, but they build foundations. And foundations determine what survives after the storm. Eventually, every conflict reaches a point where rebuilding begins. The question is always the same. What kind of people remain when the dust settles? People driven only by fear? Or people strengthened by wisdom? People consumed by division? Or people committed to understanding? The answer determines everything that comes next. That is why the deepest lesson in Civil War is not about war at all. It is about identity. Who you become when certainty disappears. Who you become when pressure rises. Who you become when the world around you feels unstable. Because those moments reveal something important. You cannot always control the chaos around you, but you can control the character you bring into it. And sometimes, that is the difference between a future built on fear and a future built on hope, because hope is often misunderstood. People think hope is wishful thinking. They think hope means ignoring problems, pretending everything is fine, or believing that somehow things will magically work themselves out. But real hope is different. Real hope sees reality clearly. It sees the damage, the conflict, the uncertainty, the fear, and still chooses to believe that something better can be built. That is not weakness. That is courage. In civil war, hope survives not because the world becomes peaceful overnight, but because there are still people willing to search for truth in the middle of confusion. There are still people willing to think when others panic. There are still people willing to listen when everyone else is shouting. Those people matter more than they realize, because every stable society depends on individuals who refuse to let fear become their identity. Fear is contagious, but so is courage. Panic spreads quickly, but calmness spreads too. That is why character becomes so important during difficult times. People are always influencing each other, whether they realize it or not. The way you respond to pressure becomes an example. The way you treat others becomes an example. The way you handle uncertainty becomes an example. And examples create culture. Culture shapes communities. Communities shape nations. That is why individual choices matter more than most people think. The future is not built only by governments, institutions, or leaders. It is built by ordinary people making decisions every day. The decision to remain honest. The decision to remain thoughtful. The decision to remain compassionate. The decision to remain human. Those decisions seem small in the moment, but over time, they become the foundation upon which everything else is built. That is the hidden message behind the journey. The world will always experience periods of uncertainty. History guarantees that. There will always be moments when people disagree, when systems are tested, and when fear tries to dominate the conversation. But every generation faces the same question. Will fear define the future? Or will wisdom? Will division become stronger? Or will understanding? Will people react emotionally? Or respond thoughtfully? Those choices determine far more than politics. They determine the kind of society people leave behind for those who come after them. That is why the movie feels less like a warning and more like a mirror. It asks viewers to look inward, not at the country, not at the conflict, at themselves. Because every person contributes something to the environment around them. Every person adds either clarity or confusion, understanding or division, hope or fear. And eventually, enough individual choices combine to shape the direction of entire communities. That is how change happens. Not all at once. Gradually. Choice by choice. Conversation by conversation. Action by action. The journalists in the story understand this deeply. They keep moving forward because they believe reality matters. They believe truth matters. They believe people deserve the opportunity to see clearly, even when the truth is uncomfortable. That belief requires courage. Because comfort is easy. Truth is difficult. Comfort tells people what they want to hear. Truth tells people what they need to understand. And understanding is the beginning of wisdom. Wisdom creates perspective. Perspective creates patience. Patience creates better decisions. And better decisions create better futures. That is why hope is not passive. Hope is active. Hope is choosing to build instead of destroy. To understand instead of assume. To remain thoughtful instead of reactive. To preserve your humanity when the world around you makes it difficult. Because in the end, the most important battle is not the one happening across cities, governments, or borders. It is the one happening inside every person. The battle between fear and wisdom, reaction and understanding, division and connection, and whichever side wins inside individuals, eventually shapes the future of everyone around them. Because nations are built by people, communities are built by people, and the future itself is built by people who choose, day after day, to become better than the chaos surrounding them.